our next session is called Development Goals, Evaluation, and Learning from Projects in Africa. We're going to talk about this obscure project called the Millennium Villages. We did invite 8 separate people from the Earth Institute to give their viewpoint, but it's really sad they were, by some coincidence, they were all 8 out of town. So what we do have is 3 speakers that are even more wonderful. We have first on my left, Michael Clemens, who's become a great researcher at the Center for Global Development, is well known for his work on migration and brain drain. He just wrote something wonderful that you can look up on the internet, is like, stop treating African health workers as property, because somebody wrote this editorial saying, you know, the West is stealing the African health workers. Well, you can only steal something if it's property, Michael pointed out, and it's insulting to talk about African health workers like they're property. So that's the kind of not only compelling economics, but also moral vision that Michael brings, which really is an inspiration. We were proud to have him as a visiting scholar at DRI in 2011. And I'm completely unbiased on Michael because I'm the one who hired him a long time ago at the Center for Global Development. So I take credit for all the good things that he does. And then next we're privileged to have Stewart Paperin from the who's the Executive Vice President of the Open Society Foundations and President of the Soros Economic Development Fund. He's been the kind of successful professional that us, lowly economists can only dream of. He's been president of Lion Rock Partners, Brook Group International, Western Union Corporation, serves on the board of most of the firms running the economy, and has been a great voice as part of the Open Society Foundation for the visions and the ideals of the Open Society. And then our last speaker is Bernadette Wanjala. She's a policy analyst at the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis. She's a PhD fellow at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And she conducted the first independent study of the Millennium Village project in Kenya, and which she may have something to say about. So please join with me in giving all the speakers a warm round of welcome. And let's hear first from Michael.
I'm going to come out here if it's okay. Can you hear me way back there? So thank you all so much for spending this time with me. 16 years ago, I was a fresh-faced young man. I walked into the World Bank to work there for the first time. I was just back from living and working here, Santa Cecilia, Colombia, on an agricultural development project. I was impatient for development. The director of external relations for the World Bank gave us an orientation session on the first day, and he said something that shocked me. He said, you know, the fundamental purpose of this institution for most of its history, the reason that skeptical donors have supported it at the base, has been communist containment, in those words. Now, this was 1996, so that reason was already fading. The whole aid world needed a new rationale. It needed a way to explain itself to voters. And 4 years later, it got that from this group. This is the Millennium Summit here in New York City, 2000, the largest ever gathering of heads of state, came together, Bill Clinton and Tariq Aziz in the same room, to issue the Millennium Development Goals, a set of global, quantitative, time-bound targets for development. Group pledged to do things like cut poverty in half by 2015, get all young children into school by 2015. Now here we are, 2015 is around the corner, the Millennium Development Goals are about to expire, and the central vision, the guide star of foreign aid, is up for grabs. you guys are going to shape that. And I want to put forward that there are, broadly speaking, two big social movements that are competing for your support. The first of these you might call the goals movement. So this emerged from the OECD. They were the ones who proposed the proto-Millennium Development Goals, the United Nations, and the NGO community in the mid to late 1990s. And again, very broadly speaking, sketching, this movement is characterized by the view that development is a process of scaling known solutions. If we know how to educate children. That's something people figured out a long time ago. We know how much it costs to educate a child, and educating all children in the world is a matter of spreading that known solution globally. Because we know what to do and because we have the money, any failure to meet this goal is a moral one. It means we didn't have the moral fiber to stand up and do it. There's a focus on external inputs, resources as a sufficient condition for change. And accountability is murky. Accountability is opaque. The Millennium Development Goals are silent on the issue of exactly what country, agency, or person is responsible for meeting them, or who will be held to account if they are not met. Now, there's an alternative movement that you might call the evaluation movement, lots of names for it, that has also arisen over the last decade and a half. It has come primarily from academia, from parts of the World Bank and elsewhere. It's embodied today in places like Development Innovation Ventures at USAID, the Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT, the International Institute for Impact Evaluation, and the World Bank's DIME initiative. And in the evaluation movement, humility is the order of the day. The focus is on testing questions, trying lots of things, failing a lot of the time, clearly identifying and surviving failures, pushing resources towards things that seem to work well, pushing resources away from things that seem not to work well. And because of that, failure is not a moral issue, it's actually required. It's not optional. It's a welcome sign that learning is happening. The focus is on local outcomes as a sufficient condition for development happening, and accountability is clear. A lot of the discussion in the evaluation movement revolves around how to figure out exactly who caused exactly what, or exactly who did not cause exactly what. Now, here's one way to describe the difference between these movements. In the goals movement, and this is the central metaphor of Professor Jeffrey Sachs' book, The End of Poverty, poor places are like sick people. They're like patients. Aid workers like physicians. Physicians have a range of known, pre-tested solutions, and the challenge lies in a proper diagnosis, having the moral fiber to act, and getting the resources to do it. And once the sickness is cured, it's cured. People go on with their lives. In the evaluation movement, development is nothing like that. You might think of it more like a young family trying for the first time to do things they never did before, like raise a child to adulthood or build a trusting relationship. The first time they do these things, nobody really knows how to do them. They make a lot of mistakes. People in a family who mess up are held to account for it. And over time, iteratively and continuously, never ending really, as long as there's a family, they figure out things to do. Outsiders can help. Outsiders can inspire. They can suggest things for you. But unlike physicians, they can't actually do anything. No outsider can raise your children for you. No outsider can fix your marriage. Now, why do I say that these movements compete for your support? Why can't it be that they complement each other? The goals people raise the money, the evaluation people figure out what to do with it, and everybody works together. What I want to assert today is that these movements conflict as they currently exist, and that it's not coherent to fully support both of them as they exist now. And to argue for that, I want to tell you about a personal experience of mine, which was critiquing the evaluation strategy of the Millennium Villages project. So it's come up. I think a lot of you know what the Millennium Villages project is. It is a multi-sector, intensive, short-term package aid intervention going on right now in 14 village clusters across Africa. Started 8 years ago in Kenya and Ethiopia. It's on track to spend about $100 million. It's being run by the United Nations and Columbia University. And it intervenes in what Professor Sachs termed the big 5 areas: agriculture, education, health, water sanitation, and infrastructure, simultaneously, with the idea, the core principle being that the whole will be greater than the sum of the parts. Now, this project has gotten very high-level support. Here's Ban Ki-moon pumping water at the Mwandama cluster in Malawi. And it's made, from the outset, absolutely extraordinary claims of what it could do. So here are some statements from 2003, 2004, when the project was just getting going, about what this project could accomplish. It said that it was a solution to extreme poverty. That's a little hard to read, I'm sorry, that it could cause isolated, very poor villages in Africa to by themselves meet these global Millennium Development Goals. That they would do this by achieving self-sustaining economic growth, that this would happen in 5 years' time, and most notably, that the effect would be sustained. That is, this would involve breaking villages free from poverty traps, which necessarily implies that the effects would go on and on after this intensive burst of aid stopped. Now, here we are in 2012, fast forward 8 years. How did it work out? Did we see self-sustaining economic growth? Have we seen poverty cut in half at the sites in 5 years' time? So the founder and director of the project in The Guardian says the project is not just successful, but enormously successful. So I would think that some of those stated goals must have happened, and we should have evidence about that. So here is the evidence brought to bear to support that conclusion. The evidence is that a lot of positive changes have occurred at the sites in several social indicators. For example, the fraction of births attended by skilled health personnel, doctors and nurses, has gone up. Now, from the standpoint of the goals movement, this is sound. This is a sound communication. It's true. I have no reason to doubt that that fact is true. And it is something to feel quite good about, that progress has happened toward these goals. From the standpoint of the evaluation movement, and I say this with sadness, this is a masterpiece of misrepresentation and opacity, because they are not telling you several things that are critical to know to properly interpret these numbers. First of all, a large part of many of these changes they're describing, changes in vaccinations, schooling, access to clean water, and skilled health personnel, are happening all across the regions they're working in, all across the countries they're working in, because this is a time of stability and prosperity for most of the countries where they're working. Thank heavens. So here's an example. Skilled birth attendants that we just looked at in Bonsaso, Ghana, one of the early Millennium Village sites in the Ashanti region. Skilled birth attendance has improved quite a lot there in 3 years of the period that the project has been working. And the project describes this as an impact, achievement, or result of its work. What they don't tell you is that this exact same indicator has been improving quite a lot all around the project. This is the rural areas of Ashanti region. Bonsaso comprises about 1% of the population of Ashanti. Now, it could be that progress in the Millennium Village is a little faster, and I'm glad to see that. I would love any woman who wants her birth to be attended by skilled health personnel to have that available. But to claim that all or even most of the change at the site is the impact, result, achievement of the project is just indefensible in light of this evidence. This goes on with several other indicators too. Here is child malnutrition. stunting, an indicator of chronic malnutrition among children under 2 years old, falling a lot at the Bunsaso site, something that's wonderful news, also described as an impact achievement result of the project. Here is how the exact same indicator has been changing in the rural areas of Ashanti region. And it might have helped to some degree, but this evidence is just not compatible for any reasonable, independent, disinterested observer with the heroic statement that the project caused the decline at the site. Now, what about those economic impacts that we were talking about before? Is this project creating economic value? That is it an economic development strategy, as the project asserts? Or is the project destroying economic value? That is it a charity? Is it giving money to get social outcomes that may or may not have an economic value in the future, something that I consider perfectly legitimate? I don't criticize charity. The project says explicitly it's not charity. So in order to assess that statement, we would need to know how much does all of this cost and what's the economic benefit. Unfortunately, we can't do that because there is no transparent information about how much it all costs and what the economic benefits are. On the cost side, the project has issued a wide range, actually, of estimates of the per capita expenditure at the sites. You can get that. What you can't get is an easy-to-interpret, transparent accounting of the full cost of everything, including travel, consultants, unpaid time by experts, office space in New York, in-kind contributions from corporate partners, all of that together. That's hard to find out. The benefit side is even harder because in the 8 years of its existence, this project has not released data on what has happened to incomes at the sites. You're going to hear the only information that's been collected and publicly released on that subject from Bernadette, who had to collect it herself. The project has not released any of that information. So recently, for the first time, it's actually possible to look into this subject a little further because the UK government is funding a new Millennium Village site in Ghana, far north of Bunsaso, near the border in Upper East region. And the UK government has certain transparency rules. So some of the documents to make some of these interesting calculations are online, and you can look them up yourself. I'm going to show you a screenshot from the business plan for this Millennium Village, which is based on the 8 years of experience, written by the project, and is based on the 8 years of experience that they've had. The full cost of this project, as you can see, is $27.1 million over 5 years in direct costs. What is the poverty reduction economic growth goal of this project? The Millennium Village aims to achieve substantial poverty reduction for up to 2,250 households. You've all got calculators in your cell phones. I don't need to tell you that this is $12,000 per household lifted out of poverty. $12,000. And I want to point out that in the latest Living Standards Measurement Survey in Upper East Ghana, household income per year is $360 US. Again, with the calculator, you can see that this project is executing a one-time present value expenditure of 33 times local incomes per year to lift families out of poverty. Now, is that creating economic value or is it destroying economic value? Another way to look at this is that you could take that $12,000, put it in the bank, and just on the interest, just on 5% interest, without ever touching the principal, you could permanently, certainly, triple everybody's income who they're targeting to lift out of poverty. Now, can the project do that? I'm skeptical. I don't know because the project has not released any information about what's happened to incomes at the rest of the sites. Another critical issue is that remember those statements about the sustained impact, self-sustaining economic growth, breaking free of poverty traps. Those are inherently long-term claims. And yet they make them based on an evaluation that has only happened while these expenditures have been flowing. Enormous expenditures relative to the local economy. And something that my co-author and I pointed out, which is just logic, in my opinion, is that those statements can't be evaluated while the money is flowing. You have to evaluate the claim that effects are sustained during the period that they're supposed to be sustained, that is after the money stops. And the project's reaction to this recommendation I find illuminating. Here's what they said. This assertion cannot be taken seriously. It would be the height of folly to delay. Economists like Clemens and de Mombin should stop believing that the alleviation of suffering must wait, needs to wait for their cluster-controlled randomized trials. Now, from the point of view of the goals movement, this makes perfect sense. This is reasonable. If you see yourself as taking to scale things that are absolutely known to work, and somebody is standing in the way of you alleviating suffering, they're promoting suffering. And that's ethically problematic, as this statement suggests that we are. From the standpoint of the evaluation movement, this statement is nonsense. It's nonsense. Diverting enormous resources away from other uses to a project based on claims that have not been evaluated and can't be evaluated. You can't evaluate long-term impacts with a short-term evaluation is not just problematic. I would even go further than that. I would suggest that it has ethical implications. And the reason is that aid money has always been scarce, is scarce, and always will be scarce. Diverting it massively to an intervention whose claims are supported only by confident assertions takes it away from things that are known to work, like the polio eradication campaign, or things that could be transparently shown to work. And that I consider ethically problematic. Now, sitting in this room, you might conclude that the fresh-faced young man who worked in Santa Cecilia, Colombia, has turned into a bitter old man. And you might be right about that. But actually, I'm more hopeful than that. I think that this could be done a lot better, and I think that you could be part of it, which is why I'm here to talk to you today. I have a lot of reasons to be hopeful. So one is, as I said, the Millennium Development Goals are expiring. For the second time in the history of foreign aid, really, the central guiding principle of foreign aid is up for grabs. You could shape that. You could be part of a new movement. A second thing that makes me hopeful, and this has been discussed fascinatingly by Yao, is that there are all kinds of new tools available to you that were not available when some of you were in diapers when they were formulating these goals. I'm talking about big data, open data, new technologies, more frequent household surveys, new analytical tools for establishing causal relationships that just weren't around at that time. And these things can make impact much more transparent than ever before. A third reason I'm hopeful is that the presidency of the World Bank is open. Now, the World Bank has been on both sides of this divide. Historically, factions in the World Bank have pushed the goals movement. Factions of the World Bank have been leaders in the evaluation movement. And really, the institution, as one of the main leaders of the aid movement, could go either way. And a new president with humility and an interest in transparent data could really take it forward in a great direction, I think. A fourth reason I'm hopeful is that this is an age of fiscal austerity. When the goals movement began in the mid-1990s, the order of the day was huge fiscal surpluses. Some of you are old enough to remember that. They were wondering what to do with all of the money. The world is totally different now. And I think that voters might be interested in some of the things that the evaluation movement has to say about clearly establishing transparent causal relationships. And the final reason I'm really hopeful is seeing all of you here. The fact that you showed up means that you're willing to intellectually engage with these debates, decide for yourself what movement to support, and then go do something about it. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. Thanks.
Stewart, Paperin now.
Good morning. Can you all hear me? happy because of three things. One is I'm not a member of either party, the goals movement or the evaluation movement. Frankly, I don't give a damn. I'm not an academic, and having to listen to some of this makes me proud that I chose to leave academia early on. But I am encouraged by the fact that all of you are sitting here and the fact that these kinds of debates go on. By way of introduction, my name is Stewart Paperin. I'm Executive Vice President of the Open Society, which is fundamentally not a development agency. It's fundamentally a human rights organization. And I'm president of Soros Economic Development Fund, which fundamentally is kind of a confusing hybrid. We are a not-for-profit that makes for-profit investments, but for developmental purposes. So we kind of tinker at the edges of development. We do what y'all, and to some degree, Bill, were talking about, which is entrepreneurship, which is we tinker. We find things that work, we find things that don't work. We fuss with them a little bit. We deal with people who are passionate about making money. The people with whom we invest in Ghana, such as, and I want to correct one point that you all made, we are not donors to Isoko. We are investors in Isoko. And every morning that the head of Isoko wakes up, he damn well better figure he needs to earn a profit to pay us back. Now, the fact that he does very good work and that he's developed a terrific developmental tool is very important. But he needs to earn a profit. And those are the kinds of people we invest in. The other reason I'm happy is that I run a $280 million development fund that's looking for ideas and is looking for the kinds of ideas that grow up here, that grow up in the Center for Global Development, that grow up at the Poverty Lab. And I've got money to spend, so I want to hear from all of you who have fundable development ideas. However, they need to be a business. They need to be capable of making a profit because we're not a donor and we're not in the grant business on the SEDF side. We are on the Open Society side, and that is what we did with Millennium Villages, which I'll return to in a moment. We look at the landscape of developing countries, whether it be, and we're active in India, we're active in Africa, we're active in Haiti and other places. We are principally focused on post-conflict areas. It is what I describe as working at the lunatic edge of emerging markets. I mean, no rational investor would invest in the places that we do when we do. And a part of our role is to prove to them that you can. So we are very, very big believers in long-term demonstration effect without randomized controlled samples. We generally focus on three areas. We build financial services funds because we believe developing countries need to be able to mobilize capital. They need to be able to allow poor people to save money. They need to be able to allow businesses to borrow. They need to allow, for example, ideas such as weather insurance, which is being promoted by Isoko and is also being promoted by a group called Leapfrog, which is a micro-insurance fund that we were anchor investors in. We invest in agriculture and because we believe it's one of the great developers of jobs and one of the great developers in a place like Africa of cash-based economies. Now, that doesn't say there aren't other things that people can do, and it doesn't say that perhaps making people productive in agriculture will prevent them from being more productive in IT or in logistics or in running a retail shop, but it gives you a choice. And we invest in logistics systems because the great missing plank of Africa is it has no logistics. I mean, it's incredible. There is no regional or Pan-African freight airline. There is no regional or Pan-African trucking company. There's been no consolidation, for example, in the trucking sector, which has happened in every other part of the world as economies emerge. And Why is that important? Because people need to be able to get goods to markets and need to be able to connect urban centers and rural centers, urban centers and urban centers, and that entire infrastructure is missing. We also fuss around, OSI fusses around the development world. We do periodically provide assistance to governments. You know, we've been instrumental. We've been close to the presidents of Sierra Leone and Liberia and Guinea, and we have helped them with macro advisory, underwriting the costs of macro advisory work, or underwriting the costs of bringing back diaspora people. One of the great tragedies, for example, in Liberia was a substantial portion of its educated class left during the wars. And the question is, how do you get somebody to give up earning $50,000 or $100,000 in the United States to come back and earn $2,000 or $5,000 in Liberia? So we've played around with that. There aren't any great solutions, but you know, hopefully we've made some contribution. So we're not development people. I've got no particular expertise in evaluation, and I have clearly told Bill, although I think there are interesting points that Michael raises and Bernadette raised in her articles, and I have heard, and I am fortunate to be close friends with Jeff Sachs and his team, and close friends with Paul Collier and his team, and hopefully will become close friends with Bill Easterly. I'm agnostic. I don't really care. I'm a really simple guy. Show me something that works and I'll put money behind it. So why did we invest in Millennium Villages? We put in close to $80 million. And how do we intend to share our experiences, and how does Millennium Villages intend to share theirs? And I want to make 2 or 3 very simple points that may sound like I'm engaging in debate, and I'm glad Bill did such a good job in hiding his predilection to assess Millennium Villages. It was really masterful. But firstly, I certainly am never going to defend public relations materials put out by Jeff Sachs. And I agree with you fully. I think Jeff always overclaims. I mean, he's a showman. He's a marketeer to some degree. He's also a serious scholar. But don't confuse scholarly work with marketing information. I trust most of you don't. I trust most of you don't run out and buy the medicine that's advertised on television every 25 minutes because there's an ad saying your elbows will be better or you'll be less depressed. You're more critical about that. Secondly, I do know that Millennium Villages has in the hopper a peer-reviewed article that is going to be published later this year. I think it is unfortunate that it hasn't been published to date, but you know, it is what it is. So why did we invest in Millennium Villages? This was a commitment made by my boss, by George Soros. I've worked for George for 16 years. I've worked directly for him. I've seen him at close sight. And something that's interesting, it was a classic decision that's very, very much in line with other decisions he's made. He bet on a person, and he bet on a program that we looked at that looked like it was feasible, didn't look like it was perfect. Nobody serious believed internally that it was going to cure poverty in 5 years. And we don't look at it as a short-term program. We very much look at this as a long-term program. And in fact, I think it was advertised as a 10-year program. And it has now completed its first 5 years of full operation. Although I guess if you count back to the early days of the Ethiopian village, it was probably 8 years. We made the investment for a simple reason. We thought there was substantial upside, and there was virtually no downside. The downside is, if it doesn't do what it's promised, it improves the lives of 500,000 people. Well, that's not phenomenal, but it's also not nothing. 500,000 people's lives was worth considering, and we did think there was substantial upside. We had internally, and we lodged 2 very serious criticisms, one of which was corrected, the other of which is now being corrected. One was it had systematically excluded local decision-making, local feedback, and particularly interaction with local and regional and state political people, which an awful lot of it depended upon, because an awful lot of the improvement in the village was an improvement in infrastructure, allowing services in and out of the village. And we thought they didn't get it, and what we did was to ask our African foundations, and we have foundations, 4 major foundations in Africa, to sit on an advisory board and work with Millennium Villages, and they did. The other criticism that we had, and it was particularly my criticism, and I am on the board of Millennium Promise, which is the parent organization, and I've raised this time and time and time again, is that unless you connect these villages and this agriculture with higher value, functioning commercial operations, and you turn these into businesses, as soon as the program is over, it will disappear. You must generate income to pay for inputs. You can't rely forever on aid. And they have been slow on the uptake, but they have now moved on the uptake, and we're working on this, and it's damn hard to do. It's extremely hard to do, to find ideas that work, and then trying to move an African farmer, particularly if it means his diversifying solely out of a cash crop, out of a food crop into a combination of food and cash crops, is not a trivial thing to be undertaken. You're putting somebody's life potentially at risk. And we didn't want to do that, and we don't want to do that. So those were issues that we had. The program was not perfect, but again, one of the points I would make, and I was really glad that I came this morning to listen to this, is one of the things that strikes me is that there's a fundamental difference between scholarly work in academia and fundamental development. And the point is a point that Bill made very clearly. He's been working on an article for 8 years. I think that's terrific. That's wonderful scholarly work. But it's not implementable and practical. It doesn't change anything except perhaps his ultimate pay. And he's now so highly paid, another article won't do anything. So the point I'm making is what I do, and to some degree what Michael does, is to work at the coalface where you really have to find implementable ideas. And what I find fascinating about development, and I hope all of you begin to, as you work through your careers, particularly the students, will find fascinating, is finding things that you can actually implement in a relative period of time and make a difference. Because I think scholarly work is terrific, and in my next life I may well be a scholar. But in this one, I really care about getting things done. Thank you. You know, there have undoubtedly been improvements in the villages. You know, food yields have increased, participation in school feeding programs have increased, health has increased. Now, whether there's causality or not is a perfectly good question that I don't know the answer to. You know, whether it's caused it or whether a rising tide floats all boats is an interesting question, and one ultimately that's useful to know the answer to. But as a practitioner and as a funder, I'm much more concerned with how do I keep this going? How do I make sure this rising tide continues to rise in these villages, and then that opportunities occur for these villages? You know, obviously causality cannot be dismissed, and I would argue that I think studying this stuff and controlled experimentation where it can be done is absolutely worthwhile. But one balances things, and one of the things one balances is cost, and the other is time to market. As anybody who has ever worked in product development or in a startup knows, time to market is critical. You can have the best idea in the world, and if you miss the market, you are just dead. And having been an investor in a company that was ready to go public 3 days after one of the major crashes in the market, and we missed the market forevermore. I know that all too well. As importantly, there is large-scale take-up. The government of Nigeria has made a significant decision to use their money, their public funds, to scale Millennium Village in their way, not with all the administrative baggage, not with all of the overhead, to 20% of the rural population. Now, how that goes is an interesting question. What they do will be worth looking at. Having people work in that scale up and trying to do measurement would be a very, very important thing, which is part of the reason that part of our grant to Millennium Villages is for evaluation. I mean, I think part of the grant, about $750,000, is specifically to do evaluation, and we demand evaluation at the end of this, but we demand it when you've got enough data to usefully paint the picture. But let me be clear, my principal interest as a business person, my principal interest as a board member of Millennium Village is making sure these ideas, which today are a little bit precious and very dependent on continuing donor support, connect and are turned to the degree that they can be into businesses. And frankly, I don't know the answer. I don't know if that can happen. I think it can. But it's taken us 9 months of work and virtually half-time of 2 of my Africa-based staff to put together a $750,000 loan guarantee that unlocks $1.5 million for one village. Now that is not scalable. I can't scale. So we sat down with them and we said, you got to get these loans and these businesses and these villages to the point where they're scalable. On the positive side, we've gone from having no intermediating structures to now having fully functioning co-ops in a couple of the villages. In other villages, we've got fully functioning companies, and those things can be the basis for growth. So what did we learn about this? One is that you probably want to better control your grantees' publicity. The second is that the villages are probably too small on an economic basis to really represent scale, and that they're going to have to reach out more broadly into the catchment area around them, which is a good thing, because that means without very much additional cost, you're going to take some of the benefit, not all, because you're not going to reach out with the health and you're not going to reach out with the education, but you're going to try to reach out with the economics to surrounding areas. And the other point you find very clearly is that one of the things that Africa is missing today is a developed entrepreneur class, and particularly a developed rural entrepreneur class. I mean, the hardest thing that we have to do in running the investment fund is to find deals to put money out into. And that is unusual, but it's the fact. Now, the question that then comes to mind is how do you improve that? And we've had some real success in doing that. In Sierra Leone, we found and in Zimbabwe, we found a very simple thing. We found by running business plan competitions, you find the weirdest people showing up with great ideas. You help them cultivate a business plan. And we've made about 20 investments, small investments, in ideas that would have never been found. So all of this is kind of a work in process. It's not elegant. It's what I would describe as messy work. But, you know, it's moving forward. Thank you.
Good morning. Okay, we've heard a lot from Clemens regarding Millennium Villages. Mine is to present some findings from a case study of impact evaluation of Sauri Millennium Village in Kenya. Now, I carried out this fieldwork in 2009, and as Clemens said, I don't think it was an easy exercise because I can say there are entry barriers into the Millennium Villages. I'm Kenyan and I didn't find it easy. because you have to seek permit, you have to seek permission, and you will be referred to Jeffrey Sachs to be able to collect data in Millennium. But somehow I managed to collect the data. Now, as an introduction, maybe I would just like to say something why we carry out impact evaluation. And mainly it's because we would like to measure the effect of development interventions on beneficiaries, which is the main goal. Like for Millennium, we know we would like to see a reduction in poverty. So if we don't look at the effect and we spend a lot of money, it can end up being a waste. The main reason why we do impact evaluation is because we know that most development programs have a large budget. I think we had from Clemens a rough idea of what it takes to end poverty. And therefore, we need to know whether these development interventions actually produce the intended benefits or not. And where we find that there are obstacles, in most cases, we need to redesign to take into consideration the shortcomings. And lastly, we also need to look at the efficiency of the expenditure, whereby you find that sometimes it's more efficient to use specific programs as compared to others to achieve the same goal. Now, looking at reasons for internal versus independent evaluation, our main motivation for looking at evaluation of Millennium Villages was that in most cases you find that internal evaluations overestimate the impacts. Like for Millennium, being a Kenyan, I thought I hadn't seen such an impact, and I was reading a lot in the media that there was a huge increase in productivity of about 200%. I actually got interested to know whether that is the case or whether it was an overstatement. And secondly, you find that in cases where internal evaluations are not rigorous, for instance, for Millennium Villages, you find that they just use before and after comparisons to estimate impact. And in such a case, it's not possible to actually attribute the impact to the intervention. Then lastly, when the results are not convincing, as Clemens demonstrated, if you find that the kind of outcomes that are purported to be coming out of the project actually are similar to national trends or regional trends, then it's very difficult to be convinced that that is impact of the project. Now, just to give a brief introduction on the Millennium Villages project, it was introduced in 2004, mainly by the Earth Institute, led by Jeffrey Sachs, and it was based on the concept of raising capital stock to self-sustained growth, which is basically a big push thinking. The investments were mainly targeted at public sector investments, which were meant to increase agricultural productivity, household income, and savings and investment. And the investments were in 5 key areas. The first one was natural soil nutrients through use of fertilizers, then human, which was in health and education, infrastructure, which was water, roads, and electricity, and lastly, finance, which was mainly access to credit. Now, the expected impacts of the interventions were mainly 3. First, increased food security and reduction of hunger through increased food supply. Secondly, it was expected to increase household income, which was through increased agricultural sales. Then lastly, they would expect indirect impacts, which would be through real incomes, through lower food prices, employment, and wage effects, which are both farm and off-farm. Now, Sauri Millennium Village was the first Millennium Village to be set up. It's in Western Kenya. And within the Sauri cluster, there are 11 sub-villages. There are 12 other villages across Africa. Now, specifically for Sauri, there were interventions in agricultural inputs and training, which was done in phases. The first phase, there was 100% input subsidy. The second year, there was 50% subsidy. The third year, there was access to credit through savings and credit organizations. Then by the fourth year, there was access to loan financing through banks, commercial banks. Then secondly, there is interventions in education, which entailed rehabilitation of school facilities and also introduction of the school feeding program. Thirdly, there was health, which was through renovation and establishment of health centers, employment of health personnel, and also provision of mosquito nets. Then the interventions in infrastructure included provision of water, which was mainly through water springs, protected springs, access roads, and also connection of the main institutions, mainly schools and hospitals, to the electric grid. Then lastly, we had market access, which was through market service centers and cooperatives. Now, the question we were asking ourselves whether is Sauri really a success of Millennium Villages project. If you look at the media, Sauri has been seen as the success story of the Millennium Villages project. And being Kenyan, I thought it's good to look at it and see whether it's really a success or not. Now, as I said earlier, the internal estimates of impacts were estimated at 200% increase in agricultural productivity. So far, we haven't seen any evaluation on the impact on income. Now, within Sauri, we saw rapid scaling up. The first year, they set up one village, and after 100% input subsidy, they scaled up to 10 more villages in the second year. So the question was what was being scaled up, because the objective was not really being given free inputs to see 200% increase in productivity. They did not wait to see what would happen when they phase out the input subsidy. Now, for Millennium Villages, the key questions for impact evaluation, and this is from them, not mine, is whether MDGs can be met, whether the changes can be attributed to Millennium Village interventions, and whether these interventions are sustainable. And I think from what we have seen so far, I think none of their evaluation reports answers most of these questions. As I've said before, they've measured success on before and after comparison where it's not possible to attribute. And we've seen calls for additional financing into the projects and, of course, further scaling up, as one of the donors has talked here. So for us, we thought it's good to know what actually is the impact before we keep asking for more aid. Now, to carry out impact evaluation of Sauri, we analyzed the impact of the interventions on agricultural productivity, and by this we proxied by maize yield, because maize was the main staple crop. Then we looked at the impact on total income, which was further disaggregated into income from sale of crops, income from employment on the farm, off-farm employment, small-scale business and self-employment, and also remittances. Now, from our impact evaluation, we saw that MVP actually increased agricultural productivity, thereby improving food security and reducing hunger. But the gains were much lower than what was reported by the MVP themselves. Ours was about 70% increase as compared to 200% increase. Now, we found an insignificant impact on total household income, which was expected, because when I was in the field, actually, just by observation, I felt I wouldn't expect an impact on income even if I do my statistical manipulations. Now, when we disaggregated income into the categories, we found that all other categories were insignificant except a significant reduction in remittances. And this is because if someone used to receive money in form of remittances and now they believe people in the millennium are better off, they've been given money, they are now rich, someone will not give you money anymore. So there was a reduction in remittances. And with this, actually, we can see that it's possible that these households could be worse off than before the project, because there is no significant impact on income, and also the remittances have reduced. Now, how do we explain these outcomes? We find that agricultural productivity increased because of an increase in input usage. There was more use of fertilizers. But in general, we see that the interventions in agriculture did not work well. Even though if you look at literature from Millennium, you will never see such reports. There was a big problem with transition from subsidies to loan financing, whereby by the third year where they had microfinance, there was very poor loan repayment. Then by the time they got to financing from the bank, they had only 10% of the farmers left in the program. So which actually raises the issue of how sustainable those interventions were, and also it poses a higher risk of these farmers actually going back to their original status before the interventions. Now we saw that lack of collateral was a big credit constraint because most of them, all they had was a small piece of land, mostly less than half a hectare, and they were not willing to give that as collateral for a loan. So that is why they could not be able to take the loan. Now, the second phase, they've shifted input access to cooperative societies, but we clearly don't know whether the previous constraints were addressed before they moved to cooperative societies. Now, the mismatch between increased agricultural productivity and income can mainly be explained by the larger reliance on agriculture. Even with the increase in agricultural productivity, you find that these farmers rely solely on agriculture, so that even if they are not food secure, they'll still sell what they have to be able to get money for the other essentials, household essentials. And as I said, the land sizes are too small. I don't know how someone is expected to get rich with a 0.5 hectare of land. However much you increase production, I think there is a limit. We also see smaller employment effects because most of the labor needs are filled by unpaid family labor. Now, there is also the issue of low prices immediately after harvest, and most people sell immediately after harvest. Millennium intervened by setting up cereal banks, which all collapsed by 2010. So issues of sustainability are still there. Now they are setting up market centers and cooperatives, but in my opinion, I still don't think markets are missing link, because when I was there, it was shortly after harvest time, and even their open market actually hardly had any agricultural produce to be sold. So I still think that there isn't much produced that really needs to be marketed. They still need to look at the agricultural interventions further. And of course, there are the institutional constraints, especially the sizes of land and access to credit. And there is also need to diversify. Millennium advocated for diversification, but there's been very minimal diversification as farmers are still mainly surviving on agriculture. Now, in terms of impacts of evaluations, for influence, I believe it matters who does the evaluations. Just as Clemens said, for those of us who are independent evaluators, it is seen as criticism and it ends there. I don't think our work can be able to shape what future programs for Millennium. In terms of the government learning from Millennium, I do not think so, because I work for the government think tank. And if you came to my office and asked 90% of the employees, none of them will tell you anything about Millennium. So does the government officials. So Millennium is just a small donor project within the country that, in any case, if the government has a hand, it's more of public relations, it's more of goodwill, but not really knowing what is going in the project. Now, in terms of spillover effects, there've been arguments that there are senior government officials who visit Sauri and have seen the wonderful ideas going on, and they are willing to have an uptake of those projects. But clearly, I cannot say that any government policies like of distribution of bed nets or school feeding program is as a result of Millennium. Because if I remember well, even from the time I went to rural Kenya for my primary school, and even those days we used to have school feeding programs whereby every parent was supposed to contribute some maize towards porridge for the child. And you could see children even carrying firewood, at least a child with one stick to provide the fuel for cooking. So school feeding programs cannot be because of Millennium. They've been there. Even in terms of distribution of bed nets, we've seen the government has been having a policy of distributing bed nets to pregnant women and children. So it is something that has been there. It cannot be seen as a spillover effect of Millennium. And because of this, I think that's why we see that there is need to ascertain the real impact of the program rather than having wide outcomes that cannot be related to the project. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. This is a photo of Sauri.
Thank you, Bernadette. That's great. We have had actually even more of a debate than the organizers expected. So I think it would be nice now to give the authors, each of the panelists, a brief chance to respond to the others. So I'm going to give you each exactly 2 minutes to respond to each other, exactly 2 minutes each. And then we'll open it up to the audience.
Can you hear me? Great. So I really appreciate Stewart coming, and especially your focus on pragmatism and on casting aside the sort of bickering. I really want to do that too. I want to take issue with a couple of things that you said. Don't confuse PR with academic statements, absolutely, but the reports this project issues have the name of Columbia University stamped on the front. It's an institution I revere. My dad used to be a professor there. And Jeffrey Sachs says in The Guardian that all of their evaluation statements are backed by peer-reviewed science. So if people are getting that impression, it's not because they are making a mistake. It's something that is actively encouraged by the project. Peer-reviewed articles being in the hopper, this is something we heard at the time that we issued our paper in October 2010, that peer-reviewed science was on the way. The article they have promoted most came out in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition last fall, in which they asserted, a year after we sent them our findings showing that child malnutrition had been declining across the regions where they're working, they asserted that it hadn't been changing. And we protested to the editors of the journal, and in the current issue this month is our letter showing that in fact that's false, and a response from the authors admitting that it's false. The peer-reviewed science that they're issuing deserves some skepticism. I just want to point that out. I want to talk more about this with you, about this issue of funders aren't interested in causality, that they're interested you said you're not so interested in clearly establishing causal relationships. To me, it's the thing that funders should be interested in establishing. As for the cost of evaluation, the data that we used to compare what's going on in the regions to what's going on in the villages are DHS data. They're freely available on the web. Anybody could have done that in 3 days at no cost. They just didn't want to do it. And that's the problem. We're not talking about huge, expensive, randomized trials. Thanks for the chance to discuss.
Sure.
Okay. Stewart?
Very quickly. I do believe that the science is good science. I think there is a difference of opinion in what's being represented. You know, I look forward, as do you, to their next article. I'm speaking from the perspective of a funder, and there's a very important point I want to make. Everybody keeps talking about this as being donor aid. Millennium Villages, while it does have some public money in it, is predominantly private aid. It is foundations, it's rich guys writing checks. This is predominantly not government money. Now, there is some government money, but I think Millennium Villages spent $100 million last year. I don't remember exactly what. Of that, you know, I know at least 70 was private aid. So, you know, this is not money that's going to be given to someone. That is an allocation to a public good. The second point I want to make on Bernadette's data is I agree with her, violently agree with her on certain points. If you don't get farmers up the value chain, they may well be worse off when the subsidized fertilizer disappears, which is why it's so important to me to get them up the value chain, which is why it's so important to me to, for example, go from solely producing maize to producing a mixture of maize and higher value pulses or higher value herbs. In terms of the co-ops, the questions you raise are good questions. The co-ops have been around for all of 2 months, as far as I know. We just don't know how they're going to work. We are, as I said, tinkering, and we welcome all of the tinkering we can find. The last point I want to, and I do agree that we do care about causality, but it's equally important to me that you look at this as a system and that you not necessarily try to disaggregate each piece, because the dynamics of systems and the lack of certainty about dynamic systems becomes exceedingly complex. And I think saying this piece of agriculture works, this piece of health works, without looking at them on a systems basis is a significant mistake. The last point I would throw out, and perhaps it's a discussion that you all ought to continue, is okay, this isn't perfect. I haven't heard anybody else sitting here propose anything to do other than to evaluate. So what's your plan?
Okay, thank you. I think I totally agree with you. The first point is to ask ourselves whether it works or not. Then maybe from there try to come up with ways of improving the system. We can't say that everything is wrong. We can't throw it out. I think what is there is to try and improve what is there and see how we can be able to meet the goals. Yeah.
Okay, now we can take questions from the audience. There's a mic that's going to go around. By the way, I was just going to throw out some more interesting factoids for entertainment. Whatever it is that DRI does or accomplishes, we do it on 0.3% of the budget of the other side. So, is that good value for money? You decide. Let's take this first question.
Mr. Riesely, on your dumb solution finding system, it seems to me that anything you find will quite often be a dumb solution. You go to fast foods in this country, and now going around the world. What it produces is a major health problem. You go to something else like the use of illegal drugs. They certainly take off, and people will go to any lengths to get them. But the results are quite disastrous for the country. We're spending money for drugs on people that are causing disasters in the countries that they live in, from Afghanistan to Mexico.
Thank you. Next. I should have mentioned, by the way, and this is not a comment on your comment, please try to keep your remarks extremely brief and try to make them a question rather than a statement as much as possible to engage in dialogue with our speakers. Next, please.
Actually, can I jump in over here?
Oh, yeah, sure, go
Thanks.
ahead. It's a democracy.
So the debate between Big Push versus RCT has attracted a lot of attention, but I think sometimes in these binary debates it's interesting to see what's elided, and that's politics. So we never actually talk about how these supposedly technical solutions will lead to systems-oriented change, to invoke what the gentleman just said. And it's ironic in a way that development keeps talking about development outside of the realm of the political, especially here where Occupy Wall Street marched down the street outside just last week. And so I'm wondering, and this is for Bill, within your kind of experimentation hypothesis,
How much can we talk about dismantling the strictures of global capitalism that lead to extraction, abuse, and general immiseration while we have these little sandcastle projects that try to build places we've destroyed back up again?
I had a question for Michael. You mentioned that aid money has always been scarce, it is scarce and always will be scarce, and you use that as an argument to suggest that the evaluation approach is most important because there's not very much money out there, so let's make sure we get the best bang for our buck. My question to you is, what does the evaluation approach do about increasing the amount of aid that's out there? Because that seems to be something the goal approach is really providing that I can't see how the evaluation approach does.
Hi, my name is Brian Turner. I'm a Master's of Development Practice student at Columbia. So I had a question for Bernadette and a question for
Welcome,
Michael.
Columbia.
Michael, in your paper, you put up some slides showing what's happening in the Millennium Villages, mirroring national trends. But even when you do the differences in differences, like focusing on the brochure, the Harvest of Development report, overall the finding is that the villages are doing quite well. And I think for the American, or for the Journal of Nutrition article, which you replied to, I think the Millennium Villages reply was that even when looking at changes within that particular time frame, the stunting reduction was about 5 times faster, even comparing within the time frame that you said in your comment. And I think they also mentioned that they thought perhaps that you'd failed to differentiate between children under 5 and children under 2 years old. So I was just hoping you could comment on that.
No, that's not true.
And for Bernadette, I think of the 5 control villages, 2 of them actually got over $100,000 worth of inputs from the Millennium Villages. And I think there's been some criticisms on 7 out of the 10 indicators that you used for the propensity score matching not being done appropriately, as well as failing to use imputed values for agricultural production. So I was just hoping you could comment on that. Thanks.
Hello, thank you. My question is for both the goals and the evaluation teams, if that's how we're dividing it. A failure that I see from this project in the beginning, and I'm not sure if it was in the conversation at the time that the Millennium Goals were being discussed, was, and it is being discussed much more now, this idea that Africa, and specifically sub-Saharan Africa, can be solved with one solution, and that Kenya, I mean, just looking at the evaluations, we have a Kenya evaluation and a Ghana evaluation, and that they are both then being extrapolated to see how the entire program works. I'm wondering, as we move forward and we really start to regionalize, especially within this continent, is there a new conversation about, once the Millennium Goals end, how we can start to scale down these projects and localize and work with local leaders instead of trying to implement something for an entire continent?
Hi. This is mainly for Bernadette, but Michael can also take this. Thanks. So you mentioned that when the government almost had nothing to do with the villages and the project, and that is also my experience from India. Like the corruption study got probably more focus in Northeast US than in India, and nothing has really changed. So my question is, do you think there is any way to engage government, even the good projects, the projects which has had proper evaluation, so that there is some kind of institutional change, and not these projects are like piecemeal efforts of researchers? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Asas. I'm also from Colombia. My question is to Bernadette. You mentioned that there was no, that the households could be worse off because their income, there was a reduction in remittances. I was wondering if you evaluated other indices of welfare, because I think it's generally known that income is not the only measure. So did you consider education, schooling levels, and health, and other indicators to assess whether the project made an impact? And I have another question for Michael. The figure you mentioned, the $27.1 million, was that for the period of 5 years? Yeah, so I did the calculation, and it comes down to $492 per person per year. And I was just wondering if you thought that was too much of an investment to make. Thank you.
Francisco Bozano, tenure in ecology. I also speak at Columbia, and I'm very glad to hear this other point of view, and it really makes New York a special place. I think that the dichotomy established here for the purpose of the dialogue between goals and evaluations is really a false dichotomy, because how can you evaluate if you don't have goals? Like how can you establish goals if you don't do evaluation? I think the biggest flaw I've seen in all the Millennium Villages is that they're making it hard for external people to evaluate. And that's for me, the serious criticism that's been made, and it's been made by somebody from the diaspora, which brings me to the next point. Doesn't the diaspora have a big role to play when we have lack of capacity in many African countries, and we have so many capable Africans here? Shouldn't we listen to them much more? Hasn't this lady made a very strong case in this direction? Thank you.
My question is for Bill and Stewart. I agree with your context, cost context and conservation bill in dumb finding systems. And as a dumb finding system myself, also known as a social entrepreneur, what would you say are the systemic barriers in non-private aid and the hidden barriers for social entrepreneurs? And what are those barriers, and what can we do as a society to bring down those barriers to go ahead and enable the dumb finding systems?
Hi, I have a double disclaimer to make. I work in the United Nations Development Program and a part-time student at Columbia. But I'm speaking here as a Mongolian. Basically, I have a question to Michael Clemens, disguised as a statement, or a statement disguised as a question. So I think to some extent, probably we need to start isolating the Jeffrey Sachs effect, because Jeffrey Sachs was at like the public face of implementation of shock therapy policies, not on the village scale, but on the massive regional scale in Central and Eastern European and Central Asian countries. So, I mean, so basically like 20 years ago, there was a public statement that he made saying if these policies are implemented, structural adjustment policies are implemented, your economy will go back to normal in 6 years. It took 10 years to go back to normal, and it is many of the countries in the region haven't actually rebounded back even now. So my question is, how would you categorize the phenomenon of using unproven economic theories for applying as macroeconomic policies for developing countries? In which camp would you place them?
Hi, there's been some interesting points today, but just maybe a plea that it would be wonderful, because there's so much money in play in international development, to move beyond just DRI and Jeff Sachs to much larger scale discussions. There's a lot more than $100 million being spent on this issue. But I would love to hear Stewart's thoughts about entrepreneurship. You know, I was just at South by Southwest. There were a lot of startups there and a lot of businesses. There were very few people from developing countries. You know, what kind of approaches could we take to have more conversations about pure entrepreneurship? I have to believe there's more than one Mo Ibrahim on the continent. You know, there's a lot of smaller Mo Ibrahims, a lot of people with some good business ideas. How can we support them, get them in front of angel investors, get them in front of VC funds more? What could we do in a solid way instead of having an international development conference where we talk about business? How do we get business leaders with business leaders, tech startups with tech startups, instead of these specialized interactions? So thanks.
Hey, how you doing? My name is Ace Valentine, and my question is for Bernadette. She mentioned about the spillover effect from the Millennium Villages to the small communities, and she said, or to the outlying communities, rather. She said that there was no spillover effect, and she mentioned the feeding programs. You mentioned that when you were a child, there were feeding programs that were already in establishment. What I want to know, and this actually goes to the home front as well, how do we If they haven't stopped, how do we make those feeding programs expand? And what can you take, using Bill's analogy of taking local input, what can you take from your experiences, and how can we apply that to the Millennium Villages to make them better?
Hi, my name is Eduardo, and I'm as well a student at Columbia University on the MPA program. And my question is to Michael. Michael, what do you think about when you presented the budget and you divided by the per capita investment? What would be your take within comparing that exercise with the exercise of doing the New York City budget within each of the New Yorkers that live here? Meaning that I think some of the budget implies services, implies the construction of infrastructure like water, sewage, and from my perspective, that will be the same as comparing the cost of policemen for we to be walking freely and safely in the city. Don't you think that will be kind of in odds to be comparing the budget like that?
Good day, my name is Ken Johnson, principal of DevConia, which is an international development firm focused on sub-Saharan Africa.
Speak up a little, please.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I'm hopefully thinking that I'm one of the diaspora that was mentioned that should be listened to, so hopefully I can get some traction here. First of all, I think one of the problems that many African diasporas say is that too many of these projects are, devised and developed out in the capitals of the United States and England and France. Why aren't they led by the local Africans? That's point number one. Point number two, Africa has about 2,000 languages, and if one describes culture as a language surrounded by a group of norms, then we typically have 2,000 cultures. And to the lady that mentioned the importance of ensuring that projects must be such that it takes into account the local culture is critically important, and that has been vitally missing. What are we going to do about that? And to Stewart, I can suggest to you that there are a number of projects that I can tell you that the African diaspora have thought about that are not only scalable, profitable, and sustainable. I think when we look at Africa, we often think that, oh, we'll just do a little bit of microfinance here and a little bit of microfinance over there. Africa requires large, scalable, sustainable business models, and we ought to start thinking about poverty reduction to wealth creation. So I'd like to address that. Thank you.
Susana Martinez, Columbia University, and UNDP. In my dissertation, I'm graduating in May, I'm working with randomized experiments, and I have gone through all that, but I'm very critical, and now in my job, in real experience, I have seen how we don't have the money to implement necessarily randomized experiments, but there's a huge gap between the political willing of enlarging a program starting from 1,000 people to 300,000 people in 1 year, and people that have no idea how to design a program and have no clear goals. And so I'm right now trying to think about a new way of evaluating without necessarily having a randomized. And this is very interesting because I think you were thinking about the same, but this was a little bit critical of what we have seen, but I would like to hear some of your ideas of how we could create like a sort of cheap evaluation where we take into account local experiences and civil society, but where we can help them out to identify a goal, because I have seen that some local projects don't even have a clear goal. So I don't know if you have some examples in Africa where there's an evaluation participating, some quantitative measures, some qualitative measures, and if you can share that for Bill and Michael. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm a new school student. I've heard a lot of talk about how we're looking at agriculture, and over the last 20 years, official development to agriculture has decreased significantly. And also the whole kind of international political spectrum that deals with agriculture and how agriculture has to be approached in terms of international trade laws has become very, very difficult. But meanwhile, all these people are still working in agriculture, and it's one of the best indicators of development of a country out there in terms of what the trajectory might be in the future. I'm just curious as to what sorts of new development initiatives focused more towards agriculture might be out there, and how those are dealing with all of these new intellectual property problems and international trade issues.
Hi, I have a question for Bernadette. Did you see in your study any impact or any changes in institutions in the Millennium Village? Specifically, for example, if there is an enhancement in accountability, if there is a lower corruption, or I mean, if Millennium Villages have any impact in institutional development and performance. And the question, I think, for all of you, and echoing Stewart a bit, what's next? I mean, is there anything positive that we can draw on to kind of engage in a different discussion? I think it is very important to have a critical approach to Millennium Villages, but there will be a point, if we are not yet there, in which there needs to turn into a more positive discussion as well, because, you know, 2015 is around the corner, and what's next?
Hi, my name is Maria Wang. I'm also from Columbia University. I work for Dr. Paperin, the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation for the Millennium Villages project. None of my comments here are to defend him in any way. I am simply seeking to understand, because I am also, like you, motivated by the movement towards development outcomes, and I'm seeking to, I care about causality and impact and accountability. The panel today has been really interesting, but it seems very heavy on debates and development, but light on the search for answers, which is the other aspect of today's conference. And I wondered if we could focus a little more on the search for answers, and to me that is a search for common ground. So with that in mind, I wondered if Bill and Michael could comment on how to reconcile their two main theses. So where does the entrepreneurial customer feedback model fit into the goals movement versus the evaluation movement? Where is the room for that? And related to that as well, I see the MVPs as being a bit caught between a rock and a hard place. So Bill on the one hand is accusing the MVP as using gold to create Kleenexes, but then on the other hand, Michael is holding MVPs up to a higher standard and saying that there should be a diamond standard. We should be more rigorous with our RCTs. So where does the answer lie? How do you reconcile those two? Thank you.
Hi, I'm a master's student from Yale University, and I'd like to pose this question to the panelists, all three of them. Given that during a randomized controlled trial, you're essentially randomly selecting a control group to not receive the perceived, what you want to ascertain to be a desired treatment, I'm curious to hear, to what extent such ethical considerations play into the dialogue between academics and multilateral organizations, or even development funds, and whether that, to what extent that gets factored into the dialogue.
Hi, I'm actually an author of a book called What the U.S. Can Learn from China. And I'm actually interested in hearing from all the panelists what you think of China's development of Africa. Thanks.
Okay. All right, we're incredibly short of time. I will give one quick generic response to the general question of, why are you always so negative? Why don't you come up with some answer? Something positive, something constructive. Well, I think that question is missing the point. The point is, don't look at some middle-aged white male academic to solve Africa's problems. Let's have political and economic freedom for Africans to solve their own problems. That's all I'm going to say. Now, for the panel, you have the impossible task of responding to incredibly intelligent, detailed questions in no time at all. You have 1 minute each to summarize what you think is summarize your major thrust of your response to all the questions.
Can I go ahead?
Sure.
So, the per capita calculation that the lady did, $492 per person income is $60 per person, so that's 8 times income. If you went to one of the people in the village that Bernadette grew up in and asked them, do you want your income to be multiplied by 8 times for 5 years, or do you want this project? What do you think they'd say? They'd say, give me the money unless you can show me that you're going to make me better off without that and doing this project. And also the calculation I did stands, they're spending 33 times income per capita as a one-off. Brian from Colombia points out that the project has had impacts. Of course it's had impacts. If I'm going to spend 8 times income per capita in a remote village of Africa, of course people are going to be made better off, and that's charity, and I admire charity, and Stewart pointed out that hundreds of thousands of people have been made better off by this project, and that's a wonderful thing. What we said in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition wasn't that they hadn't shown impacts. There's definitely impacts. It's that they concealed the fact that there was a background rate of change, and we forced them to admit it. We never said, and I will never say that they haven't had impacts. It's obvious that with tons of money flowing into a place where there is no economy, there's no modern economic growth, there are no institutions, you can create some good change. But there has to be a longer term vision for development than that. The last thing that I just want to mention, what does the evaluation movement do for increasing aid flows? In my personal opinion, a part of building the long-term constituency for foreign aid is not misrepresenting its impacts to voters, but being honest about failure and about what works and what doesn't. That's what's going to support foreign aid in the long term, and long term is when development happens, not by 3 years from now.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to selectively answer a couple of questions, and also in reference to one point. I don't think that you can annualize a per-person expenditure of building a system. I'm building a new building for my foundation. I don't look at it as an investment, a one-time investment per person. I look at it as a systematic construction over a long period of time. In terms of the questions on entrepreneurship, I think the way you solve entrepreneurship is to deal with risk return. The problem with venture capital, and particularly the problem with venture capital in emerging markets, in developing markets rather than emerging markets, is it doesn't have venture capital returns. You know, US venture capital pays back. If you hit a home run, you get 40 times your money. And that allows you to offset all the things you lose on. If you hit a home run in an emerging market, first of all, the probability is lower and the returns are lower. And therefore, you need to find a way to reprice the risk. And that's the only way you're going to get VCs to be funded, is to reprice the risk and to build capital markets. And I would rather see personally, first of all, I hate the concept of aid. I wish we would do away with the concept of aid and figure out something else. And I would love to see a large chunk of that go to reprice risk in these markets. And then you can have Africans build solutions for Africa, or Indians build solutions for India. But it's all a question of risk return. The question on China, I think, is very interesting. I personally think that China has the potential to play an extremely positive role, but you have to level the playing fields. Today, when China offers infrastructure for concessions, you need to empower the country that is receiving that offer to properly value the infrastructure and then hold the investor accountable for delivering. It's obviously a much longer story, but I think there is real room to think about how does China play a very, very constructive role in development. In terms of the diaspora ideas and investments, Soros Economic Development Fund, 1700 Broadway, please call it right. You know, we would love to look at ideas that make sense. We've got a lot of money to put to work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll also respond selectively. I think my major comments came from colleagues from Columbia University, and one question was about the use of propensity score matching. I think that is an acceptable non-experimental design that is used in impact evaluation, and it has been shown that you can get accurate results when you combine with regression methods. So whoever asked if you look in literature, it's acceptable. And I think it is also in line with someone who asked if there is any other way of evaluating projects without having a randomized control experiment. And in my opinion, I think the propensity score matching works without a baseline. So long as you meet the control variables that are required. Now, the other question of spillover effects, I think this is something we got comments from Colombia and we've put into consideration. And preliminary results show that even if we take into control the spillover effects, there is still no effect. And that is why we felt that it's important to actually be accurate in terms of what you are talking about when you are referring to spillover effect. Now, in terms of the government role, the government I know can play a role, but for this particular project, the way it was conceived, I think they didn't see the government playing any role. The only role the government must have played was maybe to show the targeted beneficiaries, to show the location. But in terms of implementation, I think the project went straight to the community and started working with the community. So far, there is really no link between the government and the project. As a way forward, I think someone said it's all criticism. I think if we understand the major role of monitoring and evaluation is to enable redesign. So for us, actually, is a way of showing that there is a need to go back to the drawing board to see how we can improve on what we have rather than stop what we are doing. So for Millennium Village, we are not saying that it is rubbish, it can't work. We are saying that it can work, but with some redesign. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank all of our speakers for a wonderful session. Thank you so much.